I have told you yesterday, you don't belong here. Why are you here again? Leave now, before I call the police.
It started with a look that said he didn't belong. No words, just a stare. Like a stranger had walked into a place he wasn't allowed. He was just standing there, waiting. But they already decided he was wrong. They didn't ask. They didn't listen. They just knew. He didn't belong. So they moved. A hand on his shoulder. A push. A whisper. Not here. The crowd didn't cheer. They just watched. Because watching was safer than acting. Because silence was easier than justice. And then the door closed behind him. Like he was already gone. Like he was already erased. But the truth doesn't disappear just because people decide it should. It waits. It grows. It forces its way in. He arrived early. Like he always did. A routine. A habit. A safe place. A job. A home. The building was tall. Glass and steel. A place where the rules were written in expensive ink. He was there to work. He was there to earn. He was there to be part of something. A place he was proud of. A place he had fought to get into. A place he had earned. But they didn't see that. They saw only what they wanted. They saw only the color of his skin, the shape of his clothes, the sound of his voice. A label. A threat. A mistake. And when the first manager walked in, he didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't ask for his name. He asked for something else. A reason. A justification. Why was he there? What was he doing? Who allowed him? And the man only stood there, silent, because he didn't need to explain. He had done nothing wrong. He only belonged, but belonging didn't matter to them. Not in that building. Not in that room. Not on that floor. The manager called security, not because of anything he did, but because of what they feared. Not because he threatened them, but because he made them uncomfortable. And discomfort is a weapon. So the security guard arrived. 2 guards, a uniformed pair, the kind that looked like they were born to be in control. They approached him. Calm, polite, but the air was cold. The words were smooth, but the intent was sharp. "Sir, you need to leave." He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at them, like he was waiting for the moment they realized they were wrong. The first guard reached for his arm, a gentle grip, but the man didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He only held his ground. That was the moment the second guard stepped forward. He didn't ask. He didn't warn. He just decided. And when he decided, the crowd agreed. The crowd watched. They didn't say anything. They didn't stop it. Because if they did, they would have to choose a side. And choosing sides is hard. So they stayed silent. And the security guards pushed. The man stumbled. Not hard, not violent, just enough to show power, just enough to remind him who was in charge. And then the door opened, and he was pushed out, like trash, like a mistake, like something that could be thrown away. But the truth was still inside, and the truth was not finished. He didn't leave, not fully. He stayed outside, in the hallway, in the corridor, in the shadows. He waited, because he knew the building was listening, because he knew the security cameras were watching, because he knew the truth was always recorded, even when people wanted to deny it. And then someone walked out, not a guard, not a manager. A worker, a woman, a quiet woman. She didn't look like she belonged either, but she did. She had been there longer than anyone. She saw everything. She didn't speak. She didn't act. She just watched. And her eyes met his. A silent understanding. A silent promise. Because she knew what had happened. She knew what they did. And she knew it wasn't the first time. And she knew It wouldn't be the last. But this time the truth would not stay hidden, because she had something. Something they didn't expect. A memory, a witness, a voice. And that was the first crack. The first crack in the wall of silence. The first crack in the story they wanted to control. And then the man did something nobody expected. He walked back inside. Not with anger, not with violence, but with calm. Like he had a right to be there. Like the building belonged to him too. And the security guards froze, because they realized they had made a mistake they couldn't undo. And the truth started to force its way in. He walked back inside, not like a guest, not like a visitor, like he belonged. The security guards didn't stop him. They didn't chase him. They didn't even speak. They just watched, because they didn't know what to do next. The manager had already made the call. He was not allowed. But the man was still there, still standing, still breathing, still existing. And that was enough to make the building uncomfortable. The crowd shifted. A few people whispered. But no one stopped him. No one defended him. No one stood beside him. Because fear is louder than courage. And the building had trained them well. The man moved to the elevator. The same elevator that took the executives to the top. The same elevator that carried the people who belonged. He pressed the button. The doors opened. He stepped in. The security guards followed. But they didn't stop him. They didn't push him out again. They just watched. Because now they were unsure. They were nervous. They were afraid, not of him, but of what his presence meant. Because he didn't look like someone who would fight. He looked like someone who had already lost. And that scared them more. Because if someone who had lost could still stand up, then their power wasn't real. It was just a performance. The elevator moved. Slow, steady, smooth. The way it always did. The way it was designed. The way it was supposed to feel safe. The man didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared. At the numbers. At the floors. At the invisible barrier between him and the top. And the security guards remained silent. Their hands at their sides. Their eyes fixed. Their posture rigid. The building was watching. And so were the people. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. He stepped out. Into a corridor he wasn't allowed to be in. A corridor where only the privileged walked. A corridor where the air smelled like power. He walked toward the office. Toward the door. The door with the name on it. The door with the plaque. The door that belonged to the manager. The door that belonged to the system. He knocked. One knock. Two knocks. And waited. No one answered. So he knocked again. And again. Because he had a right to be there. He had a right to be heard. He had a right to exist. And finally, the door opened. A man stood there. The manager. The same manager who had called security. The same manager who had decided he didn't belong. The manager who had never asked for his name. The manager who had never tried to understand. The manager who only saw what he wanted to see. The manager stared. Not with fear, with annoyance, like he was being bothered, like his time was being wasted, like the man was a problem. And the man said one sentence, not loud, not angry, just clear. I work here. The manager didn't believe him. He didn't even look at him. He simply said, then show me your ID. The man didn't move. He didn't reach for his pocket. He didn't argue. He just pointed. At the badge. At the pass. At the thing he was wearing. He didn't have to speak. The manager saw it. He saw the ID. He saw the company pass. He saw the name. He saw the badge. and his face changed. Not with guilt, with panic, because the man had what he said he had, and that meant the manager had made a mistake that wasn't accidental, a mistake that was deliberate. The manager tried to grab the pass, but the man pulled back and the manager snapped, not with anger, with fear. Fear that his own lie was exposed, fear that his power was slipping, fear that the system would finally fail him. The manager raised his hand, a gesture, a threat, a warning. But the man didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stood there, quiet, steady. And that was when the manager did something he shouldn't have done. He called the police, not because the man was dangerous, but because the man was inconvenient. Because the man threatened the story the manager had been telling for years. Because the man threatened the comfort of the building. Because the man threatened the idea that certain people didn't belong, and the manager didn't want to lose that control. And then the police arrived, but not the kind that protect, not the kind that serve, the kind that obey, the kind that follow orders, the kind that only see what they are told to see. They stepped in. They looked at him. They looked at the badge. They looked at the pass. They looked at his hands. They looked at his face. They looked at his skin. And they decided. They decided he was guilty. Even before the story began. Even before the truth arrived. Even before they heard his side. They decided. And then the building watched. And the building waited. Because the system was about to reveal its true face. The police stood in the corridor. Their badges glinted under the fluorescent lights. Their hands rested on their belts. Their posture was confident. But the confidence was fake. It was a performance, a routine, a script they'd been trained to follow. The manager spoke first. He didn't look at the man. He looked at the officers like they were his backup, like they were his weapon, like they belonged to him. "This man doesn't belong here," he said. "He's trespassing. He's causing a scene. He's a threat." The officers nodded. They didn't question him. They didn't ask for proof. They didn't ask for context. They simply believed. Because believing was easier. Because believing was the default. Because believing kept the world orderly. And order was everything to them. The man lifted his hand. He held up the pass, the badge, the ID. He showed them. He didn't say anything. He didn't beg. He didn't shout. He simply showed them the proof. And the officers still didn't believe. Not fully. Not enough to stop. Not enough to question. Not enough to admit they were wrong. One officer stepped forward, his voice calm, his tone controlled. "Sir," he said, "you're going to come with us." The man didn't move. He didn't respond. He only stared, not at the officer, at the building, at the hallway, at the doors, at the cameras, at the security guards, at the manager, at the system. He stared like he could see the truth, like he could see the pattern, like he could see the lie. And the officer moved again. He reached for the man's arm. The man didn't resist. He didn't struggle. He didn't fight. He simply let the officer take him. And that's when the building shifted. The air changed. The lights felt brighter. The sound of the elevator humming grew louder. The people outside the corridor began to gather, not because they wanted to watch, but because they were curious. Because curiosity is the first step to empathy. Because empathy is the first step to justice. Because justice was starting to arrive. But the system didn't like that, so the system fought back. The building had a cleaner, a quiet woman. She moved like she didn't want to be noticed. She cleaned like she didn't exist. She was invisible. That's what the building taught her. That's what the world taught her. But she saw. She saw everything. She saw the man. She saw the badge. She saw the pass. She saw the manager's panic. She saw the police. She saw the officer's hand. She saw the man's silence. She saw the system's lie. And she knew that the man was not a threat. She knew the manager was lying. She knew the police were wrong. So she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She stepped forward. She walked into the corridor. She stood beside the man. She looked at the officer. She spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. "He works here," she said. The officer froze. The manager froze. The building froze. Because no one had ever spoken like that before. No one had ever challenged the system. No one had ever said the truth out loud. And the truth was heavy. The officer turned his head. He looked at her. He looked at the man. He looked at the badge again. He looked at the pass again. And then he looked away. Because he didn't know what to do. Because his world was built on obedience. And now obedience was failing him. A junior staff member stood near the corridor. He had been in the building for months. He had seen the man around. He had seen him do his work. He had seen him carry files. He had seen him deliver messages. He had seen him maintain equipment. He had seen him do the job. And he had never once questioned it. Because the building was a machine. And the machine had people. And the people were just parts. But now, the machine was breaking. And he felt it. He felt the pressure. He felt the shame. He felt the guilt. So he stepped forward. He walked into the corridor. He stood beside the cleaner. He looked at the officer. He looked at the manager. He looked at the man. And he said the same thing. "He works here." 2 witnesses, 1 truth. And the building began to tremble. The manager's face turned red. The manager's voice rose. "This is not the time," he said. "This is not the place. You're causing a scene. You're making things difficult. You're making me look bad." The manager didn't say it out loud, but the message was clear. He was afraid. And when a powerful person is afraid, they become dangerous. The officer looked at the manager. The manager looked at the officer. The cleaner looked at the officer. The junior staff looked at the officer. The man looked at the officer. And in that moment, the officer had a choice. He could choose the system, or he could choose the truth. He could choose to arrest the man, or he could choose to let him go. He could choose to protect the powerful, or he could choose to protect the innocent. He could choose to stay comfortable, or he could choose to be right. And the officer chose. The officer didn't answer. He didn't make a decision. He only stared. The silence stretched. The air thickened. The building felt like it was holding its breath. Everyone waited, because the truth had finally reached the point where it demanded a response, and the response would decide everything. The officer swallowed. He glanced at the manager. He glanced at the cleaner. He glanced at the junior staff. He glanced at the man. Then he looked down at the pass again. The pass that proved everything. The pass that should have ended the situation. The pass that now made him feel like a fool. He stepped back. He took a breath. He said the words. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said. The man didn't move. The cleaner didn't move. The junior staff didn't move. The manager didn't move. The building didn't move. Because no one believed the officer. Not anymore. Not fully. Not with the way he said it. Not with the way his eyes looked. Not with the way his voice shook. The officer's hand tightened on the man's arm. And the man finally spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, not pleading, just quietly. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The officer's grip tightened. The man didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply stood still, as if he was letting the truth happen, as if he was letting the system collapse, as if he was letting justice arrive. The manager stepped forward, his voice rising. "Officer," he said, "this man is dangerous. This man is a threat. He's trespassing. He's causing problems. He needs to be removed." The officer looked at him, and something in his face changed. He looked like he had been caught in a lie. He looked like he was ashamed. He looked like he knew the truth. He looked like he knew the manager was lying. But he didn't say anything. He didn't challenge him. He didn't expose him. He only held the man's arm tighter. And that was when the cleaner did something that no one expected. She spoke again. But this time, she didn't speak to the officer. She spoke to the manager. She spoke to the truth. She spoke to the building. "You don't get to decide who belongs," she said. "You don't get to decide who is human. You don't get to decide who deserves respect. You don't get to decide anything." The manager's face turned pale. He looked around. He saw the people. He saw the witnesses. He saw the truth. And he realized something. He realized that his power was built on fear. He realized that his control was built on silence. He realized that his world was a lie, and the lie was collapsing. The manager turned. He ran, not out of courage, but out of fear. He ran into the hallway. He ran toward the elevator. He ran toward the door. He ran toward the security office. He ran toward the place where the building's power was stored. He ran toward the place where he could hide. But he couldn't hide because the truth had already reached him. The cleaner followed him. The junior staff followed her. The officer followed them. The man stayed where he was. He didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't escape. He only watched because he knew what was happening. He knew the truth was winning. He knew the system was cracking. And he knew that once the system cracked, it would never be the same again. The security room was small. The monitors were stacked. The feeds were live. The security guards sat in their chairs, their eyes glued to the screens. They didn't notice the manager. They didn't notice the cleaner. They didn't notice the junior staff. They didn't notice the officer. They didn't notice the man, because the screens were everything. The screens were the truth. The screens were the system. The screens were the control. But the cleaner knew something. She knew the screens were not the truth. She knew the screens were just the story the building wanted to tell. So she walked to the desk. She touched the keyboard. She paused. She looked at the screens. She looked at the faces. She looked at the cameras. She looked at the footage. And then she did something that no one expected. She pressed a button. The screens changed. The feeds switched. The footage began to roll. Not the live feeds, not the usual camera angles, but a hidden feed. A feed no one was supposed to see. The footage showed the manager talking to someone, the manager paying someone, the manager instructing someone, the manager creating the lie, the manager building the story, the manager creating the trespasser. The footage showed the truth, and the truth was heavy. The security guards froze. The officer froze. The manager froze. The building froze. Because the truth was no longer a rumor. It was now evidence. It was now undeniable. It was now real. The footage kept playing. The manager's voice was clear. The instructions were clear. The plan was clear. The lie was clear. The truth was clear. The officer looked at the footage. He looked at the manager. He looked at the man. He looked at the cleaner. He looked at the junior staff. And in that moment, he knew. He knew that he had been used. He knew that he had been lied to. He knew that the system had protected the powerful. He knew that the system had ignored the truth. He knew that he had been part of the problem. And the question became, what would he do next? The security room went quiet, not because the guards were stunned, but because the building finally stopped pretending. The footage was clear. The manager's voice was clear. The plan was clear. And the lie was now exposed. The officer stood frozen, his hand still on the man's arm. His grip loosened. His eyes didn't look like a man who wanted to win. They looked like a man who wanted to disappear. The manager's face was red, not with anger, with panic, with fear, with the sudden realization that his power was gone. The cleaner stood in the doorway. She didn't move. She didn't say anything. She simply watched. She waited. She let the truth do its work. The junior staff gathered behind her. Their faces were pale, but their eyes were alive, because they knew the truth, and the truth had given them courage. The officer finally spoke, not to the manager, not to the man, but to the room. To all of you, he said. I was told the man was a threat. I was told he was dangerous. I was told he didn't belong. I was told he was a problem. He paused. He looked at the footage again. He looked at the manager. He looked at the cleaner. He looked at the junior staff. Then he said the words that changed everything. I was wrong. The manager shook his head. No, he said. You were right. The officer turned to him. His eyes were sharp now, cold. I was wrong, he repeated. And you were lying. The manager's voice cracked. He tried to speak. He tried to deny it. He tried to control the situation. But the footage was already speaking. The truth was already moving. The building was already shifting. The people were already awake. And the manager knew it. He knew his control was over. He knew his story was finished. He knew the lie had been exposed. He knew he had lost. The officer stepped back. He released the man's arm. He didn't arrest him. He didn't remove him. He didn't force him out. He simply let him stand. The man didn't move. He didn't react. He just stood, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he had known the truth would come, as if he had known the world would finally see. The officer turned to the manager. You're done, he said. You're finished. The manager's eyes widened. He looked at the screens. He looked at the people. He looked at the building. He looked at the truth. And he finally understood. The truth didn't need his permission. The truth didn't need his approval. The truth didn't need his control. The truth only needed to be seen. The manager was escorted out, not by force, but by people, by the staff, by the witnesses, by the ones he had tried to silence. He walked out of the building, head down, no longer powerful, no longer in control, no longer the story, just a man who had been exposed, a man whose power had been built on lies, a man whose world had collapsed quietly. The building returned to normal, but it wasn't the same. The air felt different. The silence felt different. The people felt different, because the truth had arrived, and the truth had changed them. The man who had been labeled a problem returned to the lobby. He didn't speak. He didn't look for thanks. He didn't look for applause. He simply walked to the door. He paused. He looked back. He looked at the cleaner. He looked at the officer. He looked at the junior staff. He looked at the building. And he nodded once, a quiet nod, a nod that said, "You saw. You believed. You didn't let the lie win." The cleaner nodded back. The officer nodded back. The junior staff nodded back. The building seemed to exhale, and the truth finally settled. But the story wasn't over. Not yet, because the truth had been exposed. But the question remained. How many other lies were hiding behind the walls? How many other problems were being manufactured? How many other people were being told they didn't belong? The building was quiet, but the world was not. The truth had opened a door, and no one could close it again. The day after the incident, the building felt different. The lights were the same. The doors still opened, the elevators still moved, but the air was changed. It was heavier, more honest. The staff walked with a new weight, a new awareness. The manager was gone. The building was no longer his, and the staff knew it. They also knew something else. They were being watched, not by security, but by the truth. The officer came back the next morning, not as a threat, not as a judge, but as a witness. He walked through the lobby slowly. He looked at the staff. He looked at the people. He looked at the building. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stood. He let the silence do its work. The cleaner approached him. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't demand anything. She simply said, "Thank you." The officer nodded. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words were already there. The truth had already spoken. The new manager arrived the next week. Not a powerful man. Not a loud man. Not a man who wanted to control. A quiet man. A careful man. A man who listened. He walked through the building. He didn't rush. He didn't command. He observed. He asked questions. He listened to answers. He didn't ignore the staff. He didn't dismiss them. He treated them like people. The staff were cautious. They didn't trust easily. But they also recognized the difference. The building was changing. The culture was shifting. The lie had been removed. But the truth didn't stop at the manager. The officer began to investigate. Not the man, not the building, the system. He wanted to know how the manager had gotten away with it. He wanted to know how the staff had been forced to lie. He wanted to know how many other buildings had the same story. He wanted to know how many other people had been told they didn't belong. The officer pulled the old files, the old reports, the old incidents. He looked at them carefully, and he realized something. This wasn't a one-time thing. This wasn't just a bad manager. This was a system built to protect the powerful, a system built to silence the weak, a system built to hide the truth. The officer felt anger, but he also felt something else. He felt clarity, because the truth was finally being seen. And once the truth was seen, it couldn't be ignored. The officer called a meeting. He gathered the staff. He gathered the junior workers. He gathered the cleaner. He gathered the people who had been ignored. He didn't call the manager. He didn't call the building. He called the people. He told them what he had found. He told them how the system worked. He told them what they needed to do. He told them they had the power. Not the manager, not the building, the people, the staff, the witnesses, the ones who had been silenced. He told them, "Your voices matter." He told them, "The truth is not just evidence." He told them, "It is power." The staff listened. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They didn't cry. They just listened, because they knew. The truth was not a performance. It was a responsibility. But the system didn't like being exposed. The manager's allies were still out there. The building's reputation still mattered. The company still had power. The truth was now in motion, and the system would not give up easily. The officer received a message. No name, no signature, just a sentence. "Stop digging." The officer stared at the message. He felt a chill, not fear, but the weight of what was coming. The truth had been exposed, but the cost of truth was not yet paid, and the story was far from over. The message was simple. One line, no explanation, no warning, just a command. "Stop digging." The officer stared at it for a long time. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. Not because he was happy, but because he realized something. The system was scared. The truth was working. And the system always hated that. He didn't show the message to anyone. He didn't want to scare the staff. He didn't want to give the system power. He kept the message to himself. He knew the truth was dangerous. He also knew the truth was necessary. He made a decision. He would continue. Not for himself, but for the people. For the ones who had been told they didn't belong. For the ones who had been forced to lie. For the ones who had been ignored. He would continue. Because he had seen the truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The staff noticed the change. They noticed the officer's silence. They noticed the tension. They noticed the way he looked at the building now. They noticed the way he watched the cameras. They noticed the way he watched the doors. They began to fear, not the manager, not the building. They feared the system that protected the manager, the system that kept the truth buried. They didn't know what would happen, but they knew it wouldn't be good. And the fear made them quiet. It made them cautious. It made them even more careful. But the officer wasn't alone. He had a hidden ally, a junior staff member. A young man who had been there when the incident happened. A man who had been forced to lie. A man who had been ignored. He had been watching the officer. He had been watching the truth. He had been waiting. One night, he approached the officer. He didn't speak at first. He simply handed the officer a folder. The officer opened it. Inside were documents. Not official, not clean, but real. A list of incidents. A list of complaints. A list of ignored voices. A list of people who had been told they didn't belong. The officer looked up. The young man said, "I kept them. I knew someone would need them." The officer's eyes filled, not with tears, but with something like relief, because the truth had a weapon now, and weapons mattered. The next day, the officer received another message. This time, it wasn't anonymous. This time, it had a name, a familiar name, the name of the building's lawyer. The message was clear. "Drop the case, or we'll destroy you." The officer felt anger, but he also felt something else. He felt calm, because he knew the system was threatened, and systems don't threaten unless they're afraid. He responded with one line, "I don't work for you." He sent it. Then he waited. The building's manager called a staff meeting. He didn't look like a powerful man anymore. He looked tired. He looked exposed. He looked like someone who knew his time was ending. He spoke to the staff. He spoke in a voice that tried to sound confident. He tried to convince them. He tried to control them. He said, "You are all overreacting. You are all imagining things. You are being used. You don't belong in this conversation." But the staff had changed. They were no longer afraid of him. They were afraid of the system. But they were also beginning to see the truth, and the truth made them brave. As the manager spoke, the lights flickered. The building went silent. The elevators stopped. The doors locked. The staff froze. The manager stared. The officer stared. The building felt like it was holding its breath. Then, a voice echoed through the lobby, not from a speaker, not from a phone, from somewhere deeper. A voice that belonged to the building itself. A voice that said, "You don't belong here." The staff looked at each other. The manager's face turned pale. The officer's eyes widened. The building was no longer just a place. It was a witness, and it was angry. The building's voice had stopped. The lights came back on. The elevator began to move again. The staff tried to act normal. But no one could forget what they heard. No one could forget the way the building seemed to speak. The manager tried to brush it off. He said, "Power outage, old building, nothing to see." But the officer knew better. He knew something had changed. And he knew it wasn't just the building. It was the truth. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't chase the building. He changed his approach. He began to treat the building like a case that had a timeline, a case that had patterns. He started collecting, not just documents, not just witness statements, but small details, the kind of details that don't seem important until they become everything. He took notes. He recorded conversations. He watched the security footage, not just for the obvious, but for the subtle, for the things that didn't make sense, for the things that were too clean, for the moments where the truth tried to hide. Then he found it, a pattern, a series of small events that all pointed to the same truth. The building wasn't just a building. It was a system designed to control, a system designed to filter, a system designed to decide who belonged. And it had been doing it for years. It had been built to protect the powerful, to silence the weak, to make sure the rich stayed safe and the poor stayed invisible. The officer felt sick, but he also felt more determined, because now he knew the system wasn't just unfair, it was deliberate. The officer found something on the security footage, not a person, not a crime, but a moment where the building's doors behaved strangely, a moment where the building didn't open for someone, a moment where a door stayed locked even though the building should have opened it. He rewound. He watched again. The same moment, the same door, the same refusal. The officer stared. He felt the truth begin to form. The building had chosen. The building had decided. And the person outside the door had been told, "You don't belong." He shared the footage with the junior staff member, the one who had kept the folder. The young man watched. His face changed. He looked like someone seeing a nightmare come true. He said, "It happened to me." The officer looked at him. The young man continued, "I was locked out once. I thought it was a mistake. But it wasn't. They didn't want me to leave. They didn't want me to exist outside the building." The officer's heart pounded. He realized the case wasn't just about one person. It was about everyone. The manager's phone rang. He answered. His voice changed. He looked at the officer. He looked at the staff. His eyes were wide. He hung up. Then he said, "We're done." The officer asked, "What do you mean?" The manager's voice shook. "They know we're being investigated. They know you're collecting evidence. They know the truth is leaking." He looked at the officer like a man who had lost control of his own life. He said, "You need to stop." The officer didn't answer. He simply looked at the manager. He said, "No." The officer returned to the security room. He rewound the footage again. He watched the door. He watched the moment. And then he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A figure, a shadow, not a person, not a thief, a presence, a shape in the corner of the frame. It moved. It didn't belong. It was not part of the system. It was something else, something that didn't want to be seen, something that had been hiding in the building for years. The officer felt the hairs on his neck rise. He whispered, "What are you?" And the building seemed to answer, not with words, with a feeling, a chilling, silent warning. "Stop." The officer sat alone in the security room. The screens glowed. The air was cold. The building felt quiet. Too quiet. Like a room that was waiting. He stared at the footage. The shadow was still there, in the corner, watching, not moving like a human, moving like a thought, like a presence that didn't belong to the world. He rewound again. He slowed the footage, frame by frame. The shadow shifted. It looked like it was aware of him, as if it knew someone was watching, and it didn't like it. He tried to explain it away. He tried to say, maybe it's a reflection. Maybe it's a camera glitch. Maybe it's nothing. But the truth kept pressing. He couldn't shake the feeling. He couldn't ignore the way the shadow moved, the way it seemed to respond to his gaze. He felt a new kind of fear. Not fear of a criminal, not fear of a killer. Fear of something that didn't belong in any system. Something that had been hiding inside the building. Something that had been waiting. The junior staff member returned. His face was pale. He walked in like someone who had been chased. He didn't speak. He simply sat. The officer looked at him. He said, "Did you see it?" The young man nodded. His voice was quiet. "I saw it." He looked at the screens. He said, "It watches." The officer asked, "Why?" The young man shook his head. He said, "I don't know. But it's been here for a long time." They left the security room together. The hallway was empty. The building's silence felt heavy. They passed the elevator. It stopped. The doors opened. No one inside. The officer stepped in. The young man followed. The elevator began to move. Slowly. Too slowly. The officer pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator kept moving, but not in a normal way. It stopped between floors. The lights flickered. The air turned cold. The officer's breath became visible. He looked at the young man. The young man's eyes were wide. He whispered, "It's here." The elevator doors opened, not onto a floor, onto darkness. The officer stared. His heart raced. He felt the presence. The same presence from the footage. The same shadow. It was in the darkness, waiting. The officer stepped back. He said, "This building isn't just a place." He looked at the young man. He said, "It's a prison." The young man nodded. He said, "Not for people. For secrets. For truths." The officer felt the weight of the words. He realized the building was not just choosing who belonged. It was keeping something hidden. Something the building wanted to protect. Something that had been buried. The officer turned away from the darkness. He looked at the young man. He said, "We have a choice." The young man asked, "What choice?" The officer said, "We can walk away. We can leave. We can pretend we never saw anything. Or we can go deeper. We can find the truth. We can make the building show its real face." The young man looked at him. He hesitated. Then he said, "Let's go." They stepped back into the hallway. The building felt different, as if it had noticed, as if it was aware of their decision. The elevator doors closed. The lights flickered again, and the officer heard it. A faint sound, not a voice, not a human sound. A low, quiet hum, like the building itself was breathing. He turned. He looked at the wall, and he saw it. A small crack, a seam, a line that hadn't been there before. The building was opening, not physically, but spiritually. The truth was beginning to break through, and the officer knew. This was no longer a case. This was a reckoning. The officer stared at the seam in the wall. It was barely visible, but it was real, like a wound that had been hidden for years. He walked closer. The air grew colder. He placed his hand on the wall. It was smooth, almost like glass, but beneath it, he felt a vibration, a pulse. Like something behind the wall was alive. The young man watched. His face was tense. He whispered, "Don't touch it." The officer didn't respond. He kept his hand on the seam. He felt something move, a shift, a pressure. The wall felt like it was pushing back, as if it didn't want to be opened. He pulled his hand away. His skin tingled. He looked at the young man. He said, "It's not just a building. It's a barrier." The young man nodded. He said, "It's holding something in." They stood there, in silence. The building's quiet was thick, like a blanket. The officer felt the weight of it. He realized the building was not just a place, it was a system, a machine, a structure built to hide. He looked at the young man. He said, "We need to go deeper." The young man asked, "Where?" The officer pointed. "To the basement. The old basement. The part of the building no one goes to." The young man swallowed. He said, "That part is locked." The officer said, "Then we'll unlock it." They found the old stairwell. The door was heavy, rusty, the kind of door that hadn't been opened in years. The officer pushed. It didn't move. He tried again. The door finally gave. It opened with a long, groaning sound. The air inside was stale. It smelled like dust. And something else, something metallic. They stepped inside. The darkness swallowed them. The officer turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through the black. They descended. Each step echoed, like a heartbeat. The building seemed to watch. They reached the bottom. The basement was vast, empty, but not abandoned. There were signs, old furniture, old papers, boxes, files, a small desk. Everything covered in dust, but arranged, not thrown away, arranged like someone had left in a hurry. The officer walked to the desk. He opened a drawer. Inside was a notebook, a journal. He opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting. Not recent, old. The officer read the first line. "They don't belong here." He looked up. He felt a chill. He said, "This is a confession." The young man whispered. They read, line by line. The journal belonged to someone who worked in the building long ago, someone who understood the truth, someone who knew what the building was. The journal described a pattern, a cycle, a system that had been running for decades. The building didn't just hold people. It held memories, it held secrets, it held pain, and it fed on them. The writer had tried to stop it, but the system was too strong, too embedded. The officer felt something shift inside him. He understood. The missing man, the strange incidents, the shadow. The building was not haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by the truth. Truth that had been locked away. Truth that was so powerful it had become a presence, a living force. It wasn't angry, it was hungry. They heard a sound, not from outside, not from the building, from within the walls. A low rumble. The seam they had seen earlier began to glow faintly. The crack widened, like a mouth opening. The officer stepped back. The young man's eyes widened. He said, "It's waking up." The officer said, "It's opening." The building was no longer hiding. It was revealing. A light appeared. Not from their flashlights. From the crack itself. The light was soft, like dawn, like something waiting to be born. The officer looked at the young man. He said, "We need to leave." The young man shook his head. He said, "We need to see it." The officer hesitated. He looked at the crack. He realized this was the moment the truth would finally be seen. He stepped forward, and the light swallowed them. The light wasn't bright. It was calm, almost gentle, but it filled the basement. The air changed. The dust stopped floating. The silence became heavy, like a room holding its breath. The officer stood still. The young man stood still. Neither of them moved. The light grew. The crack widened more. It wasn't a break. It was a door, a doorway made of light. The officer swallowed. He said, "This is impossible." The young man whispered, "Or it was always possible." The crack split open, like a seam in reality. The light poured through. And inside the light, there was something else. Not a shape, not a person, a memory, a scene, a moment. It played in the air like a film. The officer's eyes widened. He whispered, "That's him." The young man said, "Who?" The officer didn't answer. He stared. The memory showed the missing man walking in the hallway. He looked tired. He looked scared. He looked aware. He turned. He looked at the camera, or at the wall, or at something unseen. He said something. The memory was silent, but the movement was clear. He was pointing at the wall, pointing at the seam, pointing at the door, like he knew it was there, like he was begging someone to open it. The memory shifted. Another scene, another moment, a different man, a worker, a supervisor, a manager. They were talking, not loud, but urgent. The manager said, "He doesn't belong here." The worker said, "We can't keep him here." The manager said, "Then we hide him." The worker nodded. The manager walked away. The worker stayed. He looked at the wall. He touched it. He whispered, "I'm sorry." The memory ended. The light pulsed, like a heartbeat. The officer turned to the young man. He said, "They knew." The young man said, "They always knew." The officer felt anger, but it was quiet, not explosive, just heavy, like a stone in the chest. He realized the building wasn't a place. It was a system, a secret, a choice, and it had been chosen for years. The young man stepped closer to the light. He said, "Why show us this now?" The officer answered, "Because it wants to be seen." The light pulsed again, like a signal, like a call. The memory shifted again. This time, it was different. It wasn't about the missing man. It was about someone else, someone alive, someone close, a person in the building right now. The light showed a figure, standing in the hallway, watching, waiting. The figure looked at the camera, then looked at the wall, then looked directly at the light. The figure smiled. Not happy, not kind, just knowing. The light dimmed. The scene ended. The basement went dark again. The crack closed. The light vanished. The room returned to silence. The officer and the young man stood frozen. The officer said, "We're not alone." The young man said, "Someone is watching us." The officer nodded. He felt the building shift, as if it was adjusting, as if it was aware they had seen. The young man asked, "Is it going to come after us?" The officer looked around. He said, "It already has." They turned. They walked toward the stairs. The basement felt different, like the building had changed. The walls felt closer. The air felt heavier. The officer said, "We need to warn the others." The young man said, "Who?" The officer paused. He realized the truth. There were other people in the building, people who had been trapped in silence, people who had been ignored, people who were still being held. The officer said, "We need to tell them." The young man nodded. He said, "And we need to leave." The officer stopped. He looked back at the closed crack. He said, "We can't leave." The young man asked, "Why?" The officer said, "Because the truth doesn't want us to." They reached the stairs. The stairwell was empty, but the air felt wrong. The officer's radio crackled. A voice spoke, not from the radio. From inside the building, the voice was calm, cold. It said, "You saw it." The officer froze. The young man's eyes widened. The voice continued, "And now you belong here." The officer whispered, No. The voice replied, yes. The lights flickered. The stairwell door slammed shut. The building locked itself. The officer and the young man were trapped. The truth had closed the door, and the building was silent again. The door slammed, hard, like the building had a hand. The officer grabbed the handle. It didn't move. The young man tried the lock. It was already locked. No key, no reason, no sound. Just locked. The air grew colder, not freezing, just empty. Like the building had taken the warmth. The officer turned. He looked at the young man. He said, "This is wrong." The young man said, "It's not wrong." He sounded calm, too calm. Like he had expected this, like he had already been here before. The officer felt a chill. He asked, "What do you mean?" The young man didn't answer. He just stared down the hall, at the dark, at the silence, at the walls, as if the building was listening. The lights flickered again, but this time, the flicker wasn't random. It was deliberate, a pattern, a pulse. The lights blinked in slow rhythm, like a heartbeat. The officer's radio crackled, but the voice wasn't on the radio. It was inside the building. It was inside the walls. It was inside the silence. The voice said, "You came back." The officer froze. He whispered, "What do you want?" The voice replied, "Truth." The officer's hands trembled. He said, "We already saw it." The voice said, "You saw the past." Then the voice changed. It became softer, more human, more familiar. It said, "Now see the future." The officer felt his stomach drop. He asked, "What do you mean?" The voice said, "You think the missing man was the only one." The young man whispered, "He wasn't." The officer looked at him. He asked, "How do you know?" The young man said, "Because I'm not the first to see this." The officer's heart beat faster. He asked, "Who else?" The young man said, "People who were erased." The lights blinked again. This time the hallway opened, not physically, but in perception. The wall on the left seemed to breathe. The officer saw it. He stepped closer. He touched the wall. The surface was smooth, cold, but it moved, like skin, like a membrane. The wall shifted. A seam appeared, a thin line, like a door. The young man said, "That's it." The officer asked, "Is this where he was taken?" The young man nodded. He said, "Or where he was kept." The officer pressed his palm against the seam. It gave way. The wall opened. A narrow stairwell appeared, dark, descending. The officer felt dread, but he also felt something else, a pull, like the truth was calling him. The young man said, "We have to go down." The officer said, "Are you sure?" The young man said, "I saw it." The officer swallowed. He nodded. They stepped inside. The door closed behind them. The building locked itself again. The stairs went down, farther than they should. The air grew thick, not dusty, not old, just heavy, like a room filled with unspoken words. The officer's flashlight cut through the darkness. The beam landed on a hallway, long, empty, but not quiet. There was a faint sound, a soft whisper, like someone breathing. The young man stopped. He listened. The officer asked, "Do you hear that?" The young man nodded. He said, "They're here." The officer's voice dropped. He said, "Who?" The young man said, "The ones who were never allowed to leave." They reached the end of the hallway. A door stood there, old, metal. A sign hung on it. The officer's flashlight revealed the letters, "Room of Names." The young man's eyes widened. He whispered, "That's where they keep them." The officer said, "Keep who?" The young man said, "People who were erased." The officer's hands shook. He pushed the door open. The room was filled with shelves, rows of shelves, like a library. But instead of books, there were boxes. Each box had a label. Each label had a name. Some names were crossed out. Some names were underlined. Some names were marked with dates. The officer stepped closer. He picked up a box. He read the label. His breath caught. It was the name of a man he knew, a man he had seen on the news, a man the city had searched for. The officer whispered, "This is him." The young man said, "Yes." The officer looked at the shelves. He saw more names, more boxes, more lives. The room was full of people the world had forgotten, full of stories the city had erased. The officer felt sick. He asked, "Why?" The young man said, "Because the building needed silence." The officer said, "And the system protected it." The young man nodded. The lights flickered. The voice returned, calm, cold. It said, "You found it." The officer turned. He said, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "I am the consequence." The officer stepped forward. He said, "What do you want from us?" The voice said, "Balance." The officer's throat tightened. He said, "How do we get balance?" The voice said, "By letting them out." The young man whispered, "They want to leave." The officer said, "Then we'll help them." The voice said, "Then you will pay." The officer looked at the shelves. He saw the boxes. He saw the names. He saw the truth. He understood. This was not just a mystery. This was a prison. And the building was the guard. The young man turned to the officer. He said, "We can't take them all." The officer said, "We have to try." The young man said, "We don't know what will happen." The officer said, "Neither did the missing man." The young man's eyes softened. He said, "Then we do it for him." The officer nodded. He picked up a box. He opened it. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder was a photo, a face, a life, a person. The officer's chest tightened. He said, "He was real." The young man said, "He was always real." The officer closed the folder. He looked at the shelves again. He said, "We open the doors." The young man nodded. He said, "And we let the truth out." The officer moved to the nearest shelf. He pulled out a box. The shelf creaked. The building shivered. The lights flickered violently. The voice shouted, "No." The officer froze. The young man whispered, "They're waking up." The officer looked at the boxes. He saw the labels. He saw the names. He saw the dates. He saw the silence. He realized the truth. Once the boxes opened, the building would never be the same. The voice screamed, "Stop!" The lights went out. Complete darkness. The officer's flashlight flickered, then died. The young man whispered, "We can't see." The officer whispered, "But we can feel." Something moved in the darkness, not a person, a presence, a weight, a pressure. The room shifted. The shelves creaked. The air filled with whispers, not loud, not clear, just alive. The building was no longer quiet. The truth had started to breathe, and it was coming for them. The darkness didn't feel empty. It felt full of something that had waited, full of something that had been locked away, full of names. The officer held his breath. He listened. The whispers grew, not words, just sounds, like breath through paper, like the sigh of someone finally allowed to speak. The young man whispered, "They're awake." The officer swallowed. He said, "What do we do?" The young man said, "We open them." The officer's hands shook. He reached for the flashlight. It clicked, flickered, came back. He shone it at the shelves. The boxes stared back. Rows of silent lives. The officer felt a pull, not fear, not curiosity, something heavier, responsibility. He lifted the nearest box. The label was faded. The name was barely visible. He opened it. Inside was a small notebook, a diary, a life, a story. The officer's eyes widened. He whispered, "This is a diary." The young man nodded. He said, "They kept them alive by keeping their stories hidden." The officer flipped the diary open. The pages were full, written in a careful hand, not hurried, not messy, a person who had taken time, a person who had wanted to be remembered. The officer's throat tightened. He read the first line. It said, "I was here." The officer looked up. He said, "They wanted to be seen." The young man said, "They were never meant to be forgotten." The room shifted again. The air grew colder, but not threatening, just real. The officer turned. He saw something moving. A shadow, not human. A shape. It drifted near the shelves. It hovered. The officer felt the hair on his arms rise. He whispered, "Is that?" The young man said, "It's the building." The officer asked, "What does it want?" The young man said, "It wants to keep them." The officer took a breath. He said, "Then we take them now." The young man nodded. He said, "Before it closes again." The officer opened another box, another diary, another life, another name. The whispers grew louder, not angry, not violent, just urgent, like a plea, like a demand, like a long-awaited release. The officer opened another box. The flashlight beam hit the pages. The words were clear. The story began. They said, "I was nothing." The officer's hands trembled. He whispered, "Someone wrote this." The young man said, "They all did." The officer asked, "Who kept them?" The young man said, "The ones who wanted the silence." The officer's jaw clenched. He said, "And the system helped." The young man nodded. He said, "The building was the system's tool." The officer looked at the shelves. He realized this wasn't just a building. It was a vault of erased lives, a vault of hidden truth. The officer felt the weight of it. He whispered, "We have to open every box." The young man said, "We can't." The officer asked, "Why not?" The young man said, "Because the building will fight back." The officer swallowed. He asked, "How?" The young man said, "Like it already is." A sound echoed, a heavy thud. The door behind them, the one they came through. The building had locked it again. The officer turned. He saw the door. It was closed. But not just closed. It was sealed. The metal had fused, like it had been welded shut. The officer said, "We're trapped." The young man said, "We're not trapped." The officer asked, "What do you mean?" The young man said, "We're inside the truth now." The officer felt a chill. He said, "That doesn't sound better." The young man said, "It is better." The officer asked, "How?" The young man said, "Because now the truth has a witness." The officer's eyes narrowed. He asked, "What about the missing man?" The young man said, "He's one of them." The officer asked, "Then why didn't he leave?" The young man said, "Because he didn't want to." The officer froze. He asked, "Why?" The young man said, "Because he knew the building would punish anyone who tried to leave alone." The officer's stomach turned. He said, "So he stayed." The young man nodded. He said, "And he waited for someone to come back." The whispers became voices, not clear, but present. The officer felt them, like a crowd behind the walls, like a chorus of silent lives. The young man whispered, "They're trying to speak." The officer asked, "Can we hear them?" The young man said, "Not yet." The officer's flashlight flickered again. The beam shook. The officer steadied it. He said, "I'm going to open one more box." The young man said, "Do it." The officer opened the box. Inside was a small device, a recorder, old, dusty, but still intact. The officer's heart beat faster. He said, "This is a voice recorder." The young man said, "Those are the ones who tried to be heard." The officer held it. He pressed play. The room filled with sound. A voice, a person, a life. The voice said, "I am here." The officer's eyes filled. He whispered, "They're talking." The young man said, "They always were." The officer said, "Then why did no one hear them?" The young man said, "Because no one was listening." The building shuddered. The shelves trembled. The boxes rattled. The lights flickered. The voices grew louder. Not angry, just alive. The officer felt a pressure behind him, like the building was pushing, like it wanted to stop the truth. The officer said, "We have to go." The young man asked, "Where?" The officer said, "Up." The young man said, "The door is sealed." The officer said, "We find another way." The young man nodded. He said, "There is always another way." The officer moved toward the wall. He pressed his hand against it. The wall pulsed, like a heartbeat. The young man said, "It will open for the truth." The officer whispered, "Then we bring the truth up." The wall shifted again. A seam appeared, a narrow opening. The officer pushed. The wall gave. A passage opened. Not a door. A gap. A crack. The officer looked at the young man. He said, "Do you trust me?" The young man said, "I trust the truth." The officer nodded. He stepped inside. The young man followed. The crack closed behind them. The room of names disappeared. The shelves vanished. The boxes were gone. The voices remained. But now they were moving, like a river, like a storm, like the truth finally breaking free. They emerged into a hallway. The air felt different, warmer, less heavy. The officer looked around. He realized they were no longer in the basement. They were in the main building. The lights were on. The hallway was normal. The world above was still moving. The city was still alive. But the officer knew the truth had already begun to spread. The building had lost control. And the young man said, "They will hear us now." The officer looked ahead. He saw a door with a sign. "Exit." The young man whispered, "This is the first time I've seen this." The officer nodded. He said, "Then we walk out." The young man said, "And we let the world see what was hidden." The officer took a step forward. The door opened, and the building sighed, like it had lost, like it had been defeated, like the truth had finally forced its way in. The hallway looked normal, but it wasn't. The air still carried the weight of the basement. The officer could feel it, like a shadow that followed him. He kept walking. The young man stayed close. They moved in silence. No words, no explanations, only the sound of their footsteps. The building seemed to watch them. The lights hummed. The walls were lined with doors. Each door looked like it led somewhere ordinary. But the officer knew better now. He knew the building hid things. He knew the building protected itself. He knew the building lied. And he knew the truth was now walking through it. The officer stopped at the first door. It was slightly ajar. A thin line of light slipped out. He pushed it open. Inside was a room. Not large, not fancy. Just a room full of chairs and people. They were sitting, waiting, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. The officer's throat tightened. He whispered, "Who are they?" The young man said, "They're the ones who never left." The officer stepped inside. The people looked up. Not with faces, not with expressions, just attention. The officer felt the pressure of their gaze. He realized they weren't empty, they were present. The young man said, "They've been waiting for someone to see them." The officer swallowed. He said, "We see you." The people didn't move, but the air changed. A shift, a release, like a breath finally allowed. The young man said, "Now we have witnesses." The officer's eyes filled. He whispered, "We do." They moved on. The hallway stretched. The doors continued. The second door was locked, but the officer didn't need a key. He pressed his hand against it. The lock clicked. It opened. Inside was a room with a table. On the table were files, not official, not neat, but messy, personal. The officer saw handwriting. He saw dates. He saw notes. He saw names. The young man said, "These are the notes they kept." The officer asked, "Who kept them?" The young man said, "People who refuse to forget." The officer's fingers hovered over the papers. He said, "Then we take them." The young man nodded. He said, "We take everything." The officer grabbed a stack. He felt the weight of truth, the weight of 1,000 silenced lives. He said, "This will change things." The young man said, "It already has." The third door was different. It had a brass plaque, a name, a title. The officer read it. His heart skipped. It was a name he knew, a name that should have been dead. The young man said, "Do you recognize it?" The officer whispered, "Yes." He felt a cold shock. He said, "That's the man who disappeared." The young man nodded. He said, "He never disappeared." The officer's voice shook. He asked, "Then where was he?" The young man said, "He was here." The officer pushed the door open. Inside was a room, a small office, a desk, a chair, a lamp. Everything was arranged like someone had just left, but the room was empty. The officer walked in. He saw a wall, covered in photographs, not official photos, personal ones, family photos, smiles, birthdays, graduations. A life. The officer stared. He whispered, "He had a life." The young man said, "He still does." The officer turned. He saw a file on the desk. The file was open. The officer walked to it. He saw the name, the missing man's name, but the file wasn't empty. It contained a list of people, names, dates, locations. The officer's stomach dropped. He whispered, "This is a list of the missing?" The young man said, "Yes." The officer asked, "Why would he keep this?" The young man said, "Because he knew someone would eventually need it." The officer's hands trembled. He said, "Then he wasn't lost." The young man said, "He was hiding the truth." The fourth door was heavy. It felt like it had weight, like it had been locked for a long time. The officer pushed. It opened slowly. Inside was a room full of mirrors, not decorative, not fancy. Just mirrors. They reflected the hallway. They reflected the officer. They reflected the young man. But the reflections were wrong, not distorted, just different. The officer saw himself, but older, worn, hollow. He saw the young man, but not as a young man, as a figure, a shadow. The officer stepped closer. He whispered, "What is this?" The young man said, "This is what the building wants you to become." The officer asked, "Become what?" The young man said, "Someone who looks away." The officer's jaw clenched. He said, "I won't." The young man said, "Then don't look into the mirrors." The officer turned away. He felt the building's pressure. He felt it trying to pull him into the reflections. He whispered, "Is this how they kept people silent?" The young man said, "Yes." The officer nodded. He said, "Then we break the mirrors." The young man shook his head. He said, "We don't break them." The officer asked, "Why not?" The young man said, "Because the truth is not broken." The officer stared. He understood. He said, "We use them." The young man said, "Yes." The officer looked at the mirrors again. He saw the reflections. He saw the lives. He saw the faces, not detailed, just presence. He realized the mirrors were not meant to trap. They were meant to show. The officer whispered, "Then we let them see." The fifth door was the last. It was marked differently. No plaque, no sign, just a simple handle. The officer opened it. Inside was a room with a single chair, a single table, a single lamp. The room felt empty, but the officer could feel it. A presence, a final witness. The young man stepped inside. He said, "This is where the truth sits." The officer asked, "What truth?" The young man said, "The truth that forced its way in." The officer sat. The young man sat across. They waited. The room stayed silent. The officer's heart raced. He whispered, "Is this it?" The young man nodded. He said, "Now we speak." The officer asked, "To who?" The young man said, "To everyone." The officer looked around. He whispered, "How?" The young man smiled, not with his mouth, with his eyes. He said, "We open the doors." The officer's breath caught. He whispered, "All of them?" The young man nodded. He said, "All of them." The officer stood. He said, "We go back." The young man said, "Yes." The officer turned. He looked down the hallway. He saw the doors, the witnesses, the truth. He felt the building behind him, but it felt weaker, less sure, less in control. The officer whispered, "Let's open them." The young man nodded. He said, "And let the world hear the voices." The officer took the first step. The doors began to open, one by one. The whispers became voices. The voices became sound. The sound became a flood. The building trembled, but it didn't fight. It didn't scream. It didn't collapse. It simply let go. And the officer knew this was the moment the truth finally forced its way in. The first door opened, not with a creak, not with a dramatic sound, just a soft shift, like a secret finally deciding to be honest. The voices came first, not loud, not angry, just present. The officer froze. He listened. The voices weren't screaming. They were telling. They were remembering. They were holding on. The young man stood beside him. He whispered, "They've been waiting for someone to hear them." The officer swallowed. He said, "We hear you." The second door opened. The room with the files, the papers, the messy notes. The officer stepped inside. He saw the stack he had taken. It was still there. But now, it was different. The papers were moving, not like wind, like hands, like a slow wave. The notes rearranged themselves. The officer stared. He realized they were forming a pattern, a story, a timeline. The young man said, "They're telling us what happened." The officer whispered, "This is a record." The young man said, "Not a record, a confession." The officer felt his skin prickle. He said, "Then we must listen." The young man nodded. He said, "And then we must act." The third door opened. The missing man's office, the wall of photos, the list of names. The officer stepped in. The photos seemed to glow, not with light, with meaning. He realized each photo was a life. Each life was a person. Each person was a story. The young man said, "They were not forgotten." The officer's voice shook. He whispered, "They were hidden." The young man said, "Yes." The officer looked at the list. He saw the names. He saw the dates. He saw the pattern. He saw the truth. The missing man had been collecting evidence, not to hide it, to preserve it. The officer whispered, "He wasn't lost." The young man said, "He was protecting the truth." The officer stared at the list. He said, "Then we bring it out." The young man nodded. He said, "Out of the shadows." The fourth door opened. The mirror room. The reflections. The wrongness. The officer stepped inside. He didn't look at the mirrors. He looked at the people, the ones sitting, the ones waiting. He saw them, not as shadows, as individuals. He saw their presence. He saw their dignity. He realized the mirrors weren't meant to trap. They were meant to show. The young man said, "Now they can see themselves." The officer whispered, "And now we can see them." The young man nodded. He said, "And now they can be heard." The officer felt the building's pressure again. But this time, it felt weaker, like it was losing its grip, like the truth was pushing through. The fifth door opened. The empty room, the chair, the lamp, the truth. The officer stepped inside. The young man followed. They sat. The room was silent. But the silence was different now. It wasn't heavy. It was ready. The young man said, "This is where the truth waits." The officer whispered, "And now we deliver it." The young man nodded. He said, "Let the world hear." The officer walked back into the hallway. The doors were open behind him. The voices followed, not as noise, as proof, as testimony, as truth. He felt the young man's hand on his shoulder. He looked up. The young man's eyes were steady. He said, "Now they know." The officer asked, "Know what?" The young man said, "That they can't erase us anymore." The officer's throat tightened. He whispered, "They tried." The young man said, "They failed." The building trembled, not violently, just a slight shake, like it was adjusting, like it was being forced to accept reality. The officer felt something shift, a lock, a seal, a barrier. It opened, a path, a way out. The young man said, "This is the exit." The officer stared. He said, "Why now?" The young man said, "Because the truth has no door it cannot open." The officer nodded. He said, "Then we leave." The young man said, "Yes." They walked toward the exit. The hallway seemed longer now, not because it was stretched, but because it held more. More stories, more lives, more truth. The officer reached the door. He pushed. The door opened. Light poured in, not harsh, not bright, just real. The young man stepped out. The officer followed. They emerged into the world. The air felt different. The sky looked different. The world felt awake. The officer looked back. He saw the building, standing still, but not in control. Not anymore. He whispered. The truth forced its way in. The young man nodded. He said, "And it stayed." The officer and the young man walked away. Not running, not hiding, just walking. The world was waiting. And now the world had to listen. The truth had been unleashed, and nothing would ever be the same. Truth never travels alone. It brings enemies with it. By morning, the city had split in two, those who wanted answers, and those who wanted silence. The officer felt it the moment he stepped outside. Eyes followed him, not curious, calculating. A police cruiser rolled past slowly, too slowly. The young man noticed it too. He leaned in and whispered, "They're watching." The officer nodded. He said nothing. He'd expected this. The truth had escaped the building, but the building had not forgotten. At the station, the atmosphere had changed. Voices dropped when he walked by. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else wouldn't meet his eyes. A captain pulled him aside, not angry, not kind, careful. He said, "You've caused a situation." The officer replied, "The situation already existed." The captain sighed. He said, "People upstairs are nervous." The officer asked, "Because they were exposed?" The captain didn't answer. That was the answer. By noon, the story had shifted online, not erased, reframed. Headlines softened. Language changed. Words like allegedly and unclear crept in. The young man slammed his phone down. "They're rewriting it." The officer nodded. "They always do." The young man asked, "Will it work?" The officer looked out the window, at the city, at the people walking below. He said, "Only if we let it." That evening, a knock came at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, measured. Two men stood outside, plain clothes, official posture. One spoke. Just a few questions. The officer didn't move. He said, "About what?" The man smiled thinly. "About your involvement." The young man stepped forward. He said, "We told everything already." The second man replied, "Sometimes the truth needs clarification." The officer felt the chill. He said, "No, sometimes it just needs courage." The men left, but the message stayed. That night, the young man couldn't sleep. He paced. He asked, "What if they come for us?" The officer answered calmly, "They already have." The young man stopped. "Then why aren't you afraid?" The officer thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Because fear is what kept the door locked." Silence filled the room, heavy but steady. By morning, protests had begun, small at first, then louder. Then impossible to ignore. Signs rose, voices rose, names were spoken aloud. The missing man's name echoed through the streets. The officer stood at the edge of the crowd, in plain clothes, anonymous, listening. The young man whispered, "They're not letting it go." The officer replied, "Neither are we." The truth had stepped into the open, and the system had responded the only way it knew how, by pushing back hard. But something had changed. For the first time, the truth wasn't alone. The cost didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, small enough to ignore, sharp enough to hurt. The officer was removed from active duty. They didn't call it punishment. They called it administrative reassignment. A desk, a windowless room, no badge on his chest, no radio crackle, just files, old ones, irrelevant ones. A way to make him disappear without saying the word. He signed the paper, didn't argue, didn't flinch, but when he stood up, his hands trembled. Just once. The young man lost his job. No explanation. Just a short email. "We're going in a different direction." He read it twice, then a third time. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. He showed it to the officer. "Guess I didn't belong there either." The officer nodded. That's how the system speaks when it doesn't want to be honest. Friends stopped calling. Not all, but enough. Enough to notice, enough to feel. People crossed the street instead of saying hello. People sent messages that started with, "I support you, but..." The young man deleted those messages without replying. The officer didn't. He kept every one. Proof of how fear sounds when it pretends to be reason. The officer received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single sentence, typed, "Some doors should stay closed." He folded the paper carefully, placed it in a drawer, locked it. Not because he was scared, because he wanted to remember. One night, they sat together at the kitchen table. No phones, no news, just 2 cups of cooling tea. The young man finally asked it. Was it worth it? The officer didn't answer right away. He stared at the table. at the small scratches in the wood, at the place where a life had been interrupted. He said, "I ask myself that every morning." The young man leaned forward. "And?" The officer met his eyes. "Every morning, the answer stays the same." "It's not about what we lost," the officer said. "It's about what would have been lost if we stayed quiet." The young man swallowed. "Like him." The officer nodded. "Like everyone after him." Silence followed, not empty, resolved. Across the city, pressure built. The protests grew. Journalists dug deeper. A name that had been buried was now spoken on air. Questions multiplied. Not accusations. Questions. The most dangerous kind. And somewhere inside the building, people began to worry. Speaking had a price. They were paying it. But the truth was finally costing the system something too. Walls don't collapse all at once. They crack, quietly, in places no one is watching. It started with a question no one expected. A city council member, one who had stayed silent through everything, leaned into the microphone and asked, "Why was the report edited after it was signed?" The room froze. The chief cleared his throat, spoke about procedures, protocols, clerical timing. But the question didn't go away. It lingered, echoed. People wrote it down. A journalist found the timestamp, not leaked, not stolen, public, buried in plain sight. The report had been altered 6 hours after submission. 6 hours after the young man had already been declared non-threatening. 6 hours after the narrative was supposed to be finished. The headline didn't accuse. It didn't shout. It simply asked, "Why?" Inside the department, officers whispered. Not loudly, not on record, but enough. One said, "If they changed his report, what did they change in mine?" Another asked, "Who decides what belongs?" No one answered, but no one laughed either. He watched the news with the officer, saw his own face blurred on screen. He didn't recognize himself anymore, not because he'd changed, because the world was finally seeing him differently. He said quietly, "They're listening now." The officer shook his head. "They're afraid now." An internal review was announced, not demanded, announced. That mattered. It meant the wall felt pressure. It meant someone inside had decided silence was riskier than truth. Files were requested, emails archived, statements compared. The system began doing something it hated, looking inward. Not everyone welcomed the crack. A union representative went on TV, called it a witch hunt, called it political, called it dangerous. The officer watched without blinking. "They always say that," he murmured, "because truth threatens comfort more than lies ever did." Late that night, the officer's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Almost. A voice said, "I shouldn't be calling you." The officer stayed silent. The voice continued. "They're asking the wrong questions." Pause. "But they're finally asking." The line went dead. Who was that? The officer exhaled slowly. Someone who's been quiet for too long. The next morning, a document surfaced. Not leaked, released. A supplemental report. Unsigned, unexplained. Contradicting the original narrative. Just enough to make denial impossible. Just enough to force the next step. The wall was still standing, but it wasn't solid anymore, and everyone inside could hear it. That faint, dangerous sound. The sound of something about to give. They called it a routine briefing. No press, no public notice, just a long table, cold coffee, thick folders. The chief sat at the head, jaw tight. Across from him, legal counsel didn't open her notebook. She didn't need to. She said one sentence. "We have a problem." No one asked what kind. Everyone already knew. "Who knew?" she continued. "And when?" Silence answered first. Then someone shifted in their chair. Another cleared their throat. Because the truth wasn't that one person knew. It was that many had known. For the first time in that room, someone said his name. Not the subject, not the individual, his actual name. It landed heavy. Names make things real. Names don't disappear. The press caught wind of the meeting. They didn't know details, but they smelled fear. Cameras returned to the steps. Microphones waited. A reporter said, on air, "Silence can be policy until it becomes evidence." The young man sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped, knee bouncing. The officer watched him carefully. "You okay?" He nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. "I just keep thinking," he said. "If they say my name now, why didn't they before?" The officer didn't answer. Some questions don't need explanations. They need accountability. At 2:14 a.m., an email was sent. All staff. Subject line, preservation notice. No deletions, no edits, no lost messages. Everything stays. Everything counts. Silence had officially expired. By morning, a supervisor was placed on leave. Not fired, not charged, but removed. Temporary, administrative, still a signal. The wall didn't just crack, it shifted weight. He stood in the station hallway, felt eyes on him. Some angry, some relieved. One officer stopped him quietly. "You were right," he said. The officer studied him. About what? That this wouldn't stay buried. For the first time in weeks, the young man walked alone. No hood, no rush. A stranger nodded at him. Another said, "Stay strong." He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Silence had protected them for years. But once it started talking, it told stories no one could control anymore. And the truth? It was just warming up. They thought they still had time. They were wrong. The department released a statement at 9 a.m., carefully worded, soft edges, no admissions. It said they were reviewing internal procedures. It said they take community concerns seriously. It didn't say his name. That omission was noticed immediately. The clip resurfaced again. Not the loud part, not the struggle, the quiet moment, the pause, the hesitation, the second where the officer looked unsure. Someone slowed it down. Someone zoomed in. Someone added timestamps. The narrative stopped being theirs. Not interrogated. Not yet. Asked to clarify. He sat across from two suits who didn't introduce themselves. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They just asked him to repeat what he already knew. What did you see? What did you hear? What did you do? Truth is easier the second time. Harder for the people listening. An old incident report surfaced. Same block, same complaint, different name. The pattern was suddenly visible, and patterns don't argue back. He didn't want to, but the TV was already on. His face wasn't shown. His name was finally said. Once. Carefully, like it might explode. His phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize. "Thank you for surviving." He stared at it for a long time. Doors closed faster now. Conversations stopped when someone entered. Trust was rationed. The officer noticed a change. People weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking what's next. Standing room only. No chanting. No signs. Just people waiting. A council member said, "We cannot investigate ourselves and expect the public to believe us." The room didn't applaud. It exhaled. Not police, not uniforms. Quiet relocation. Temporary. He declined. "I've been moved enough," he said. He stayed. Visibility felt safer than shadows. A memo appeared online. Internal. Time-stamped. Contradicting the official timeline. It spread without commentary. Truth didn't need captions anymore. Once the story escaped its handlers, it didn't come back. It didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for approval. The narrative broke. And when it did, everything behind it started falling forward. The word changed first. Not the outcome, not the facts, just the word. They stopped saying incident. They started saying action. Not publicly, not yet. But inside the system, the placeholder disappeared. Forms updated, initials replaced. A name typed carefully, then retyped. Once it existed on paper, it couldn't be erased. Not to ask questions, to set boundaries. What could be said, what must not, what would be remembered later. Silence became strategic, but silence also left room. Not with apologies, with scheduling options. They were asked when they were available, as if trauma worked by appointment. They chose a date anyway. Because absence felt like surrender. He didn't speak to the press. He spoke to an investigator. His statement was short, precise, unemotional. He described a moment he hadn't reported, because no one had asked. Until now. Minutes disappeared. Seconds gained meaning. The gap between commands and compliance narrowed. The story became less flexible. Not in court. In a room with no windows. He didn't embellish. He didn't accuse. He just told it the way it happened. They asked him to repeat one part. He did, exactly the same way. Press releases grew shorter. Fewer adjectives, more dates, more numbers. Facts replaced comfort. Not suspended. Not reassigned. Just sent home. A precaution. He sat in his car longer than usual. Watched people walk past. Noticed how many avoided eye contact. Accountability didn't arrive loudly. It arrived with paperwork, with witnesses, with names typed where blanks used to be. And once a name was written down, the story stopped being theoretical. Not to the public, to departments, phrases repeated, ongoing review, no determination at this time. Language designed to pause momentum. Calendars filled, actions slowed. Every step now required approval. Every approval required another meeting. Not rewritten, buffered. Words like force became contact. Impact became interaction. The facts stayed. The edges dulled. Not instructed, advised to stay quiet, to avoid social spaces, to let the process work. The process had already begun working, for itself, this time by someone new. They looked for inconsistencies, found none. So they looked for tone, then motivation, then proximity, anything that could shrink its weight. No official updates. Still, questions spread. Because silence doesn't stop curiosity, it sharpens it. Calls returned slower. Emails answered with templates. They weren't being ignored. They were being managed. The change, the distance, the way concern became procedural. He stopped expecting empathy. He focused on accuracy. Unintentionally, a version sent before edits, before softening, before replacement words. It showed the original phrasing. The first truth. Someone always does. Containment works until it doesn't. Because truth doesn't disappear. It waits. For the wrong email, the wrong attachment, the wrong moment. It wasn't dramatic, no announcement, no whistle. Just a file moving where it wasn't meant to go. First to one inbox, then another, then a group chat. No commentary, just the image. Words highlighted by accident. Unfiltered, unsoftened, clear, direct. No ambiguity. What happened was stated plainly, before it was edited into something safer. Side by side. Original wording. Final release. The gap wasn't small, it was deliberate. No one needed to ask why. The edits explained themselves. Someone wanted less attention, less responsibility, less consequence. A recall notice, a clarification, a statement about draft materials. But drafts don't erase screenshots. They compare. They show timelines. They let the documents speak. No opinions needed. Not from officials. From someone forwarding the image. No message. Just the file. And silence. Every word. The version that existed before caution. Before containment. Before fear. It confirms what he felt. And what he was told not to believe. Inside the department. Someone leaked. Which meant someone disagreed. Which meant the system wasn't as united as it appeared. Shorter, urgent, no talk of optics, only exposure. Advice changes. Silence becomes liability. Distance becomes risk. The truth didn't explode. It slipped. And once it slipped, no one could pick it up quietly again. No one announced it. But the system stopped steering. It no longer belonged to press rooms, or legal teams, or internal memos. It belonged to people comparing facts, line by line. They wait. They read headlines before drafting responses. They react instead of framing, not by investigators, by analysts, by journalists, by ordinary readers, dates, times, edits, everything mapped, not accusations, just patterns, stops that ended the same way, reports written the same way, language reused. It's not one incident, it's consistency. And consistency doesn't argue. No outrage, no pleading, just confirmation. They let the documents carry the weight, no rally, no march, just voices aligning, sharing, repeating, remembering. From denial to explanation, from explanation to containment. Not announced, but scheduled sooner. Files requested faster, questions more direct, not surrounded, but no longer alone. People recognized the silence he carried. The system was built to control stories. But this one didn't wait. It moved first. The word accountability sounded different now, not like a slogan, like a consequence. A supervisor is called into a room. No cameras, no press, just a closed door. And the kind of silence that makes people speak truth by accident. They say, "We need to understand what happened." But the tone has changed. The tone is no longer defensive. It's cautious. It isn't public. It's not meant to be. But it happens faster than usual. It looks at patterns, not only actions, but language. The same phrases, the same procedure, the same resisted, the same didn't belong. It's not flattering. It's not careful. It's precise. And it doesn't excuse anything. Not a firing, not a dismissal. Something worse. A removal from active duty. A slow, quiet removal. The kind that avoids headlines, but still ends the same. Not from a lawyer, not from the press, from someone in authority. Someone who now knows the truth. It offers something else. A recognition. A statement. A "we're sorry," without the weight of celebration. Not through news, through reality. The kind that hits slowly. Not about what happened, but about what was allowed. Not in anger, in denial. But their words sound thinner now, like they've lost the script. It becomes about the system that protected him. The system that called it procedure. The system that said he didn't belong. It isn't dramatic. It isn't explosive. It's just real. And real is harder to deny. Justice didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with a shift. A quiet shift. A shift that changed the story. Forever. The city doesn't move the same way anymore. It slows down. As if it's waiting. Waiting for the moment the truth can't be ignored. It's human now. The story is no longer about procedure. It's about a life. A young man. a family, a silence that was supposed to stay buried. Not riots, not shouting, just people standing in silence, looking at each other like they finally understand what they've been living in, from headlines, from social media, from conversations, not because people forgot, but because they stopped supporting the lie. They call meetings. They speak in calm tones. They promise review. They promise reform. But the words sound like they are being said too late. Not to the public, not to the press, to the department. He says, this was not an isolated incident. The room goes quiet, not because it's shocking, but because it's true. She doesn't cry anymore. She just listens, because she knows the truth is not loud, it's heavy, and it will break the world quietly. Not, did he belong? But, why was he treated like he didn't? Not from strangers, from people who've been there, people who understand the cost, people who know the meaning of being told, you don't belong. Not with evidence, with silence. The people who used to support him stop answering. They don't want to be associated with the truth. A statement is released, not a confession, but a recognition, a mistake that can't be denied, a word that changes everything. Unjustified. The word hits the air like a weight. It changes the way people walk, the way they talk, the way they breathe. Not to defend him, to distance themselves, to protect their own lives. But the words still matter, because the truth is no longer theirs to hide, not for revenge, for recognition, for his right to exist, for his right to belong. Not as a spectacle, as a process, as a slow, heavy step toward balance. Not because it's dramatic, because it's just, because it was always going to come. The truth was too heavy to keep inside. The truth didn't come like a storm. It came like daylight, slow, quiet, unavoidable. The court is not a battlefield. It's a place where truth is forced to stand still, where lies have to speak, and where the city finally listens, not with noise, with a stillness that feels like grief. The mother sits. Her hands are steady, but her eyes are empty, like she's already been through the worst. Not with drama, with calm, with documents, with facts, with the kind of quiet that makes the room tense. They bring up procedure, they bring up context, they bring up the old lies, but the room doesn't respond, because the truth has already been seen. This time, people watch, not to judge, but to understand, to see what they refused to see before. It's realization, it's shame, it's the moment a city admits it was wrong. Not by the people, not by the system, not even by the silence. He becomes alone, not because he is guilty, but because the truth has left him. Not loudly, not emotionally, just honestly. She doesn't beg. She doesn't cry. She simply says, "He was my son." And the room holds its breath. The words feel slow, like they are moving through thick air. The judge says, "Not justified." The room reacts, not with cheering, but with a release, like a long-held breath finally leaving the body. Not victorious, not relieved, just free from the weight of silence. They don't celebrate, they don't smile, they simply walk, because the truth has finally returned. Not overnight, not suddenly, but slowly. People begin to question, begin to watch, begin to refuse the lies. Not a hero story, a caution, a reminder that the system can be wrong, that the truth can be hidden, and that the only way to protect the innocent is to keep watching. The mother stands outside the courthouse. The sun is low, the air is quiet. She looks at the sky, not happy, not sad, just real. And then she says, softly, "He belonged here." The truth didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like a long-awaited morning. Quiet, heavy, unavoidable.